Paul, as a demographer, how did you end up deciding that it was important for people to understand why the Western canon is our birthright?
Well, I don't know that it really relates to my demography very directly. I suppose they are my two main interests, are demography and generally culture, whatever that means. And I suppose I do have a sense, though, if there is a link between the two of them, of the tide going out of something we're losing in the West. Now, as I always say in demography, the problems of late fertility rates, aging and declining populations are not a specifically Western thing. The West was the first into them. In many ways, they're worse in East Asia and in parts of Latin America. So this is very much a human problem. But the West was first into it and first out of the demographic transition in a way. And in the same sense, I feel there is some loss of Western civilization, whatever that means. And we'll probably come on to that in due course. And that has two aspects. One is what's being produced today. Is it better or worse than in the past? And that I don't really feel qualified to opine on. I think a lot of novels that are coming out today are probably as good as things that were written in the 19th century. Art is challenging and very different, but I don't feel very qualified to talk about that. But if I think about someone like Beethoven, clearly ahead of his time, clearly a bit mad, and got on people's nerves. And yet, he had a serious audience. And earlier composers were definitely writing for their contemporaries. And, people like Bruckner and Mahler and Shostakovich were hugely appreciated in their day. It's very difficult to think of composers today who are appreciated that widely, whether that's to do with the nature of what they're writing or the nature of the audiences. But apart from that, so what's the quality of the output today, which I've got absolutely no ability to do anything about anyway? I do think there's a loss of appreciation. And the example, I always think of this, and funnily enough, I was listening to a podcast I did with Louise Perry. Yes, I'm afraid unlike Ed, I do like listening to my own podcast. If I don't like it, I do it because I think I learn about what I do well and what I don't do well, and therefore I improve. So actually, I was saying this on a podcast I did with Louise Perry, but it was recorded a long time ago and only came out last week. And so I said it there, but I'll say it again. It very much struck me when I was a child. My parents had a shop, and they had a shop assistant called Celia, very charming, very good with the customers, never wanted any kind of responsibility. She did what she did, and her husband was a shop worker similarly. Both had left school. I doubt they even were there at the age of 14. Both came from working class London families. Both were of the age that they went off to fight in the war. They both had very active wars in different ways, came home to real poverty. But they were absolutely enraptured by art and culture, music. And I remember that for my birthday, I was very fond of this lady who helped in my parents' shop for decades. And she always bought me a birthday present, and she bought me amazing things. I remember one year, the Sibelius Violin Concerto, just to take a piece at random. Another year, the Borodin Second Symphony, pieces I absolutely love. And look, they weren't super educated. They weren't really educated at all. And they weren't, they didn't have a deep, or what we'd call in any way intellectual understanding of Western civilization, but they knew it was something that it was worth aspiring to. They aspired to it, and it gave them huge amounts of enjoyment and gratification in their lives. And then I compare that to when I started working. Actually, in my late 20s, I ended up working in a consultancy where almost everyone had been to Oxford or Cambridge. And they'd all come, not necessarily from super privileged families, but they'd had years of education and they'd gone to the best universities. And they were really, really clever, but most of them wouldn't know. I mean, if I said to them, it's quite interesting to compare Mozart and Haydn string quartets, for example, or, never mind the difference between Shostakovich and Schoenberg. They would not have had a clue, and they would have thought I was being a terrible snob, even talking in these terms. But really what it boils down to is my sense that we have an amazing heritage and legacy, however you define what Western civilization is. I don't mean to rubbish or disparage any other civilization. I'm not going to say it's better or worse, although it is interesting with the appeal that classical music has. in Asia, for example, I did go to a concert when I was in Singapore, and the performers and it seems to be truly transnational, and maybe that means it's special. But whatever, whether it's superior, inferior, or equal to other civilizations, I feel we live in a time of mass education. People spend years and years learning, and they're not really appreciating and imbibing this stuff. And this stuff, I suppose, after my family relations, after my marriage and my children, so again, a link to demography maybe, is the thing that's most important to me in the world. And I'll just close with one anecdote. I'm not going to say who it is, but I knew a very, very senior, well-known clergy person, let's put it that way, who said to me, I was listening to the Schubert Quintet the other day, and I have to admit, it moved me more than any prayer ever has, although I'm not supposed to say that. So I think it's just something that's incredibly life enhancing. And if I can encourage others to have their lives enhanced by it, so much the better.
Paul, that bit you mentioned at the end, how the musical experience you had was transcendental in a way that prayers haven't moved you toward, is interesting, because I think those who do attend church, they sometimes can't get on board with the sermon. It can either be too theological or a little bit too bland. But when it comes to the hymns, if it's a really, really good hymn, it's rousing. People understand the message. They get it through the feeling. There's something about music that can bring a message home that word on its own perhaps can't. Ed, why do you think that the appreciation of the canon has diminished in recent generations?
I suppose I'm like Paul. I think he described himself as a techno-optimist, but pessimist, and I'm of the same brand. I think we'll probably all end up living to 300, but spend our time watching TikTok reels with them all. I don't know. I have to admit, I have a sort of ingrained tendency towards pessimism about at least on these cultural issues, and I've also found that there is also a particular British aversion to high culture and intellectualism, which I think has also always been there and is in some ways quite protective, in that we sort of tend to not take continental ideas too seriously. But I mean, this started. Well, I originally wrote a sort of article about it, about why aren't there sort of canon class, why aren't there kind of salons where people talk about these things, and we end up hosting with a friend, 3 of them, before this. My basic fear was kind of personal one, is that I felt like I wasn't educated enough, and that's entirely my own fault, especially classical music. I'm not so into it, and I find as an outsider, it's very hard to sort of get to grips with it. It's almost like a language to start off. Once you have that background, it's different. And I also felt there was I sort of fear that we aren't passing on these traditions, that our children aren't going to know about them, and that all these they're sort of going to end up like dusty books and libraries, which are still there, and no one's stopping them, and no one's burning them, but no one's taking an interest anymore. There is obviously an argument that technology just offers so many different opportunities for people. I mean, it's just so much easier to watch television than to read, for example, and that's been a complaint for some time. But I do think the general culture in Britain has become quite moronic. And my main gripe with the BBC, for example, is that if you just turn on any television, BBC, and I just don't watch it for this reason more than anything, it's so incredibly lowbrow. And even documentaries that try to look at culture or history, for example, just take it as assumed that everyone watching it is a complete moron, and it has to be at the very, very lowest level. So, my hope is that there can be, within this kind of mix, an enlightened media which tries to assume that everyone has an actual interest in high culture and would like to learn more. And we're in our own small little way doing that to sort of create that. That's my hope anyway. Whether people are actually interested, maybe people just want to watch TikTok reels about Baby Gronk for the rest of their lives. I don't know.
Your point about BBC being incredibly lowbrow, it's true to say that it wasn't always the case. And back in the 70s, and I know you chaps sort of watched this, I'm sure. In fact, Ed, I'm sure I've seen you write about it, but Kenneth Clark's Civilization series.
Richest news ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite unbelievable, and I think he opens with what is civilization, and he tries to ask the question and answer the question. And what's really sad about the BBC now is that they on iPlayer you can't even go and find things like civilization. They've removed them, and you got to go on YouTube. And so I'm gonna refract that into a demographic question, actually, Paul, because as you write about, and as you well know, the West has gone through a demographic transition. It's some could point towards inevitable collapse, however it is that you want to look toward it. And we live in a cultural and political landscape which sees new terminology thrown up, usually with a progressive bent, which is in some way to diminish the Western peoples. And you'll hear terms like global majority, to try and point towards the legitimacy of non-Western peoples who have settled in the West. Do you think there is, and I don't know if you're alluding to it earlier on, do you think that in this world of growing diasporas, and I can see a rising sense of Anglo identity, particularly in our Zoomer generation, is this a way in which to hold on to something of substance for this culture and its admirers, should that demographic collapse come to pass?
Well, that's a huge question. I think when we were planning this, one of the strap lines I wanted to use somehow, and I don't think we have, is when it comes to the culture wars, we need more culture and less war. Now, I don't think we don't need war. I think it's Ed who said when you're accused of engaging in the culture wars, it normally means you're just not waving the right white flag, right? So I do agree, though, that I do think we need culture wars when certain ideas are being suggested and then imposed. It's perfectly legitimate to push back on them. Ideas that have been historically completely contrary to what people believe. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong, and it's perfectly legitimate to discuss them. But neither does it mean, because an idea is new and would have shocked and horrified previous generations, that it's right and that it's an outrage. So I think in this venture, there's something about culture wars and at least putting a bit of culture into the culture war and not just war. And that sort of comes to remembering what it is that if we believe in Western civilization, it's three things I always think, essentially. It's first of all, the amazing scientific and technological advances we've made, which I mean, the techno-optimism, which Ed was talking about, which I do hold to, which has allowed us to lead these comfortable lives. Here we are on Zoom, sitting in December in warm rooms in England and Scotland with full stomachs. I mean, a whole range of things which go back 8 or 9 generations. And many people 3 or 4 generations, that would not have been the case. So the technological brilliance of science, which allows us to understand the world and to control it and to live much better lives. The second thing is the political settlement, imperfect though it is, that allows us to sit here broadly for now and have conversations about all sorts of things and have some contribution to the political situation in the country, somehow have a sense of being in a legitimate political order. And then the third thing is Western civilization and the canon and the classics and the absolute genius. Transcendental, I think, was the word you used. And that is a word I think that absolutely hits the nail on the head. In many ways, in fact, it kind of became the religion of Europe as religion waned in the late 19th century among intellectuals, anyway, art for art's sake and so on. And I think that contribution is extraordinary. Now, I don't know I haven't really thought about it in terms of a sort of demographically declining group of people holding on to something as they diminish. But I do think that in the wokeness, there is a degree of hostility to classical civilization, to Western civilization. So that I remember I went to I think it was a Singer Sargent exhibition last year, and I also went to the Rijksmuseum, and I think in both occasions I ended up taking a photo of the clip, the sort of explanatory clip, and sending it to Ed. It was just, it was politically correct, blah, blah, unless it was
awful.
talking
They're
about
awful.
slavery or something, it just wasn't worth. And I almost can't bear to go into the British Museum, and just because I can't bear to read the explanatory plaques, everything has to be refracted through some kind of post-colonial lens. And again, I've got no problem with that as a literature and a way of thought, but it seems to have become the case that if it's not universal, if that is not the lens through which you are seeing and interpreting something, then there is really no other lens through which you should be seeing it. And I think it was the head of the South Bank Centre. There was some major cultural figure or sort of manager who said, "Ooh, classical music's not cool." And you see that in the decline of orchestral music, certainly. I mean, Wigmore Hall, for example, is still wonderful. But you get less and less classical orchestral music outside the proms in London. So I think there is, I mean, maybe it's not really answering your question, but along with the culture wars, I think there is an extent to which there is a war on Western culture, however defined. And if Western culture is to be appreciated, it can only be appreciated through the lens of a post-colonial narrative. Now, again, let's look at it through a post-colonial lens, fine, but can that be one of many lenses to look through it rather than the only one that is legitimate? And it seems particularly at exhibitions, that's the case. The choice of music on Radio 3, for example, it seems that if you don't have a composer from a minority background or a woman every so often, someone at Radio 3 has said you have to do that. Now, again, there may be wonderful composers from many different backgrounds we haven't appreciated, and there may be many great women composers. So I don't mind. I think that's wonderful to expose us to some new folks. But on the whole, I'm afraid the dead white man still has the quality when it comes to music. And, it feels like substandard music's being imposed, and that music's being imposed, not hugely, but to an extent on, say, Radio 3, because of the identity of the composer rather than the quality of the music. And I could name you, I'm not going to composers I hear on Radio 3, where I say, if that weren't an X or a Y by some kind of category or class, that music would not be on the radio. And I think one could say that fairly objectively.